Welcome to a new series on the book of Judges. This series should probably come with a warning that you may find some parts distressing. One writer has summarised Judges as a book about despicable people doing deplorable things. And the tragedy of it is that those people are God's people. Judges is also a book about the faithfulness and mercy of God. Judges begins with these words: after the death of Joshua. In the previous book of the Old Testament, under Joshua's leadership, God brought Israel into the land he had promised to Abraham and his descendants. The land was already inhabited, so receiving God's gift of the land also involved conquering it. While there was still much to be done to take full possession of the land at the end of Joshua, that book emphasises God's faithfulness in keeping his promises and giving the land. After the death of Joshua, the book of Judges paints a very different picture, one which foregrounds not the faithfulness of God, but the faithlessness and failure of God's people. Chapter 1 describes the historical situation. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, "Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands." Things seemed to begin well in the first half of chapter 1, as we read about the tribes of Judah and Simeon taking possession of various places. This was a good beginning, you might ask. I mean, we are talking about military conquest, and we read about destroying cities, putting them to the sword and burning them to the ground, and cutting off the thumbs and big toes of an enemy king to disable and humiliate him. Let me say a few things about this Old Testament holy war, as it has been called. First, it is limited to the very specific context of Israel's entering the Promised Land. The rules and practice of Israel's military engagement are different elsewhere in the Old Testament. And for Christians, the New Testament makes clear that our warfare is spiritual, not a struggle against flesh and blood. So it would be wrong to use this warfare to justify, for example, the Crusades of the Middle Ages. Second, Genesis 15 speaks about God only allowing Israel to conquer the land once the sin of the land's inhabitants had reached its full measure. Here in Judges 1, even King Adonai-Bezek recognises God's justice. Adonai-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Then Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. Third, as we shall see, the issue at stake in the conquest of the land was not economic wealth or political power or ethnic cleansing, but spiritual allegiance. With that explanation, things seem to begin well in the first half of Judges 1. But the second half of the chapter shows that God's people could not or did not drive out the inhabitants of the land. Sometimes they made deals with the inhabitants of the land. Sometimes they lived among them. Sometimes they pressed them into forced labour. And sometimes they were simply unable to take possession of parts of the land. The historical description of chapter 1 contains hints about the cause of the Israelites' failure to take possession of the land. For example, right at the beginning, we read this: after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, "Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands." The men of Judah then said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, "Come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours." God says the tribe of Judah shall go up, and the first thing Judah does is ask Simeon to go with them. At one level, that makes sense, because the two tribes were closely related and the land allotted to the smaller tribe of Simeon was contained within Judah's portion. But is there also a suggestion that the men of Judah were looking to bolster their own strength rather than trust in God's strength? Or what about verse 19, when Judah begins to fail? The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron. The Lord was with them, but they were unable to drive out people who had iron chariots? Are we supposed to think that iron chariots were too much for the Lord? Chapter 1 describes Israel's failure to take possession of the promised land and hints at the cause of failure. Chapter 2 gives a clear spiritual diagnosis of the problem. I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt and brought them into the land he had sworn to give them. He would never break his covenant with them, and he expected exclusive covenant allegiance on their part. They were not to make a covenant with the people of the land, but break down their altars. The issue was spiritual allegiance. What does God say now? You have disobeyed me, so the people and their gods will become traps and snares to you. And so it was. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Daniel Block observes, peaceful coexistence with the world leads to cohabitation and alliance with the world, which in turn leads to taking on the religious notions of the world. The heart of Israel's failure was not military defeat, but spiritual apostasy. That is, they abandoned the Lord in favour of other gods, claiming to belong to him while acting as if they belonged to others. Did you notice that they served other gods, plural? In the world of paganism and pluralism, there are many gods with influence in different areas of life, and the worshipper can mix and match according to their needs and desires. What does the Bible say? There is one true and living God who brooks no rivals. Even in a secular society, we have idols, don't we? Lawson Younger writes, the myth of secularism is that there are no idols because there is no God. Whenever created things are given a central religious importance in life, they become idols. Whatever you look to for identity, security, meaning, power, there are your idols. There is a lesson for us here about lordship. Israel was to take possession of the whole land, remove all other religious influence from their life, and live in undivided loyalty as God's people. Jesus claims lordship over every part of your life. As a Christian, it's important to look at every area of life, relationships, family, work, time, money, and possessions, and ask yourself, am I willing to do whatever God says about this area? Am I willing to accept whatever God sends in this area? Are there areas of life where I am saying to God, I cannot, or I will not? Listen to how Judges 2 describes the beginning of this period of spiritual decline. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. What happened? The new generation didn't know God or what he had done for them, so they went after other gods. It is so important to pass the faith on to younger generations. For parents, how are you passing the faith on to your children? For all of us as a community, how are we passing the faith on to the next generation? Personal faith is a gift of God brought about by His Spirit, not something we can mechanically produce in others. But we have a vital role to play in passing on the good deposit of the gospel to those who come after us. We find in the book of Judges that Israel's spiritual decline in this period was marked by a repeated cycle and a downward spiral. They served other gods. The Lord allowed their enemies to oppress them. They cried out to the Lord in their distress. The Lord had mercy and sent a judge, a deliverer, to save them. They had peace for a time. Then the judge died, and they followed, served, and worshipped other gods again. Again and again and again, becoming even more corrupt over time. There is a need for continual spiritual renewal among God's people. Do we treat the danger of apostasy seriously? Judges 2 verse 17 graphically describes the unfaithful Israelites as a married prostitute. They are pledged in covenant to the Lord, but they sell themselves to other gods. Their apostasy had its unspectacular roots in partial obedience, limited trust, spiritual complacency, and half-hearted discipleship. We need to be growing continually as Christians. Psalm 1 uses the image of a tree to show us how, by delighting in and constantly applying God's word to our lives. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Our neighbours had a line of pine trees cut down this week. One of the trees was already dead, even though it was still standing, accidentally poisoned some time ago. The others were still alive and growing, of course. Did you know that trees are constantly growing? If a tree is cut down, you can look at a cross-section of the trunk and count the growth rings to see how old the tree is. The only trees that aren't growing are dead. How are you nourishing your own spiritual growth as a follower of Jesus? As we finish today, I want you to notice one more thing about the repeated cycle of Judges, and that is the unceasing mercy of God. There is a tension between God's anger and his mercy in this cycle and in the Old Testament, a tension only resolved on the cross of Christ, where God's anger and mercy are both expressed perfectly. God's anger at apostasy is justified and forewarned. His mercy is marvelous. The people refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways, but God refused to give up on his people and his promises. The people's faithlessness provoked God's anger, but his own faithfulness provoked his mercy. Ultimately, God's anger and mercy towards his people are both expressions of his love, his rightly jealous and wonderfully forgiving love toward us. When we find ourselves in times of spiritual decline and perhaps under God's discipline, we should cry out to him, because our hope is not improved performance, but undeserved mercy.